Welcome, young and young at heart. Welcome to Pastor Cullen's reading time. I'm really excited that we're doing this because we get to read one of my favorite books of all time, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe by C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis is a fantastic writer from the 20th century. He was a scholar in Oxford in medieval fairy tales and folklore. He was a great Christian apologist as well, and that's what he's probably most famous for. Anyway, I read this book when Elizabeth and William were young, and since then we've read it multiple times, the whole series. But I wanted to read this to you this morning. So everybody get comfortable, everybody get relaxed, and we're going to read a couple chapters of this book. Then come back next week on Tuesday. We'll read a few more, and then Thursday a few more until we're done with the book. So let's read together. The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe by C.S. Lewis. Chapter 1. Lucy looks into a wardrobe. Once there were 4 children whose names were Peter, Susan, Edmund, and Lucy. This story is about something that happened to them when they were sent away from London during the war because of the air raids. They were sent to the house of an old professor who lived in the heart of the country, 10 miles from the nearest railway station and 2 miles from the nearest post office. He had no wife, and he lived in a very large house with a housekeeper called Mrs. Macready, and 3 other servants. Their names were Ivy, Margaret, and Betty, but they don't come into the story very much. He himself was an old man with a shaggy white hair which grew over most of his face as well as his head, and they liked him almost at once. But on the first evening, when he came out to meet them at the front door, he was so odd-looking that Lucy, who was the youngest, was a little afraid of him, and Edmund, who was the next youngest, wanted to laugh and had to keep on pretending he was blowing his nose to hide his laughter. As soon as they had said good night to the professor and gone up to stairs for the night, the boys came into the girls' room and they talked it over. "We've fallen on our feet, no mistake," said Peter. "This is going to be perfectly splendid. That old chap will let us do anything we like." "I think he's an old dear," said Susan. "Oh, come off it," said Edmund, who was tired and pretending not to be tired, which always made him bad-tempered. "Don't go on talking like that." "Like what?" said Susan. "And anyway, it's time we were to bed." "Trying to talk like mother," said Edmund. "And who are you to say I'm to go to bed? Go to bed yourself." "Hadn't we all better go to bed?" said Lucy. "There's sure to be a row if we're heard talking here." "No, there won't," said Peter. "I tell you, this sort of house is where no one is going to mind what we do. Anyway, they won't hear us. It's about 10 minutes' walk from here to that dining room, and any amount of stairs and passages in between." What's that noise?" said Lucy suddenly. It was a far larger house than she had ever been in before, and the thought of all those long passages and rows of doors leading to empty rooms was beginning to make her feel a little creepy. "It's only a bird, silly," said Edmund. "It's an owl," said Peter. "This is going to be a wonderful place for birds. I shall go to bed now. I say, let's go and explore tomorrow. You might find anything in a place like this. Did you see those mountains as we came along? And the woods? There might be eagles. There might be stags. There will be hawks." "Badgers," said Lucy. "Foxes," said Edmund. "Rabbits," said Susan. But when the next morning came, there was a steady rain falling, so thick that when you looked out of the window, you could see neither mountains nor woods nor even the stream in the garden. Of course it would be raining, said Edmund. They had just finished off their breakfast with the professor and were upstairs in the room he had set apart for them. A long, low room with 2 windows looking over in one direction and 2 in another. Do stop grumbling, Edmund, said Susan. 10 to 1 it'll clear up in an hour or so. And in the meantime, we're pretty well off. There's a wireless and lots of books. Not for me, said Peter. I'm going to explore the house. Everyone agreed to this, and that was how the adventure began. It was the sort of house that you never seemed to come to the end of, and it was full of unexpected places. The first few doors they came to only led to spare bedrooms, as everyone had expected they would. But soon they came to a very long room, full of pictures, and there they found a suit of armor. And after that was a room all hung with green, with a harp in one corner. And then came 3 steps down and 5 steps up, and then a kind of little upstairs hall and a door that led onto a balcony, and then a whole series of rooms that led into each other and were lined with books, most of them very old books, and some bigger than a Bible at church. And shortly after, they looked into the room and saw that was quite empty, except for one big wardrobe, the sort that has a looking glass on the door. There was nothing else in the room, all except a dead blue bottle and a window seal. There's nothing in here, said Peter, and they all trooped out again, all except for Lucy. She stayed behind because she thought it would be worthwhile trying the door of the wardrobe, even though she felt almost certainly it would be locked. To her surprise, it opened quite easily, and 2 mothballs dropped out. Looking into the inside, she saw several coats hanging up, mostly long fur coats. There was nothing Lucy liked so much as the smell and the feel of fur. She immediately stepped into the wardrobe and got in amongst the coats and rubbed her face against them, leaving the door open, of course, because she knew that it is very foolish to shut oneself into a wardrobe. Soon she went further in and found there was a second row of coats hanging up behind the first one. It was almost quite dark in there, and she kept her arms stretched out in front of her so as to not bump her face into the back of the wardrobe. She took a step further in, then 2 or 3 steps, always expecting to feel the woodwork against her fingertips, but she could not feel it. This must be a simply enormous wardrobe, thought Lucy, going still further in and pushing the soft folds of coats aside to make room for her. Then she noticed that there was something crunching under her feet. I wonder, is that more mothballs? She thought, stooping down to feel with her hand. But instead of feeling the hard, smooth wood of the floor of the wardrobe, she felt something soft and powdery and extremely cold. This is very strange, she said, and went on a step or 2 further. The next moment, she found that what was rubbing against her face and hands was no longer soft fur, but something hard and rough, even prickly. Why, it's just like branches of a tree, she exclaimed. And then she saw that there was a light ahead of her, not a few inches away, where the back of the wardrobe ought to have been, but a long way off, Something cold and soft was falling on her. A moment later, she found that she was standing in the middle of the woods at nighttime with snow under her feet and snowflakes falling through the air. Lucy felt a little frightened, but she felt very inquisitive and excited as well. She looked back over her shoulders, and there, between the dark tree trunks, she could still see the open doorway of the wardrobe and even catch a glimpse of the empty room from which she had set out. She had, of course, left the door open, for she knew that it is very silly to shut oneself into a wardrobe. It seemed to be still daylight there. I can always get back if anything goes wrong, thought Lucy. She began to walk forward, crunch, crunch, over the snow and through the wood towards the light. In about 10 minutes she reached it and found that it was a lamppost. As she stood looking at it, wondering why there would be a lamppost in the middle of the wood and wondering what to do next, she heard the pitter-patter of feet coming towards her. And soon after that, a very strange person stepped out from among the trees into the light of the lamppost. He was only a little taller than Lucy herself, and he carried over his head an umbrella, white with snow. From the waist up, he was like a man, but his legs were shaped like a goat's. Their hair on them was glossy black, and instead of feet, he had goat hoofs. He also had a tail, but Lucy didn't notice this at first because it was neatly caught up over the arm that he held the umbrella, so as to keep it from trailing in the snow. He had a red woolen muffler around his neck, and his skin was rather reddish too. He had a strange but pleasant little face, with a short pointed beard and curly hair, and out of the hair there stuck 2 horns, one on each side of his forehead. One of his hands, as I have said, held an umbrella. In the other arm he carried several brown paper parcels. What with the parcels and the snow, it looked as if he had been doing some Christmas shopping. He was a fawn. And when he saw Lucy, he gave such a start of surprise that he dropped all his parcels. "Goodness gracious me!" claimed the fawn. Chapter 2. What Lucy Found There. "Good evening," said Lucy. But the fawn was so busy picking up the parcels that at first it did not reply. When it had finished, it made her a little bow. Good evening, said the fawn. "Excuse me, I don't want to be inquisitive, but should I be right in thinking that you are a daughter of Eve?" "My name is Lucy," said she, not quite understanding him. But are you, forgive me, you are what they call a girl?" asked the fawn. "Of course I'm a girl," said Lucy. "You are, in fact, human?" "Of course I'm human," said Lucy, still a little puzzled. To be sure, said the fawn. "How silly of me, but I've never seen a son of Adam or a daughter of Eve before. I'm delighted. That is to say," and then it stopped, as if it had been going to say something it had not intended, but had remembered in time. Delighted, it went on. "Allow me to introduce myself. My name is Tumnus." "I'm very pleased to meet you, Mr. Tumnus," said Lucy. "And may I ask, oh, Lucy, daughter of Eve," said Mr. Tumnus, "how have you come to Narnia?" "Narnia? What's that?" said Lucy. "This is the land of Narnia," said the fawn. "We're where we are now, all that lies between the lamppost and the great castle of Cair Paravel on the eastern sea. And you have come from the wild woods of the west?" I got in through the wardrobe in the spare room," said Lucy. "Ah," said Mr. Tumnus, in a rather melancholy voice. "Ah, if I had only worked harder at geography when I was a little fawn, I should no doubt know all about those strange countries. Well, it's too late now." "But they aren't countries at all," said Lucy, almost laughing. "It's only back there. At least, I'm not sure. It's summer there." "Meanwhile," said Tumnus, "it's winter in Narnia, and has been for ever so long. And we shall both catch a cold if we are to stand here talking in the snow. Daughter of Eve, from the far land of Spare where the eternal summer reigns around the bright city of Wardrobe, how would it be if you came and had tea with me?" "Thank you very much, Mr. Tumnus," said Lucy, "but I was wondering whether I ought to be getting back." "It's only just around the corner," said the fawn, "and there'll be a roaring fire and toast and sardines and cake." "Well, that is very kind of you," said Lucy, "but I shan't be able to stay long." If you will take my arm, Daughter of Eve," said Mr. Tumnus, "I shall be able to hold the umbrella over both of us. That's the way. Now off we go." And so Lucy found herself walking through the wood arm in arm with the strange creature as if they had known one another all of their lives. They had not gone long before they came to a place where the ground became rough and there were rocks all about, and little hills up and little hills down. At the bottom of one small valley, Mr. Tumnus turned suddenly aside as if he were going to walk straight into an unusually large rock. But at the last moment, Lucy found he was leading her into the entrance of a cave. As soon as they were inside, she found herself blinking in the light of a wood fire. Then Mr. Tumnus stooped and took a flaming piece of wood out of the fire with a neat little pair of tongs and lit a lamp. "Now, we shan't be long," he said, and immediately put the kettle on. Lucy thought she had never been in a nicer place. It was a little, dry, clean cave of reddish stone, with a carpet on the floor, and 2 little chairs, "one for me and one for my friend," said Mr. Tumnus, "and a table and a dresser, and a mantelpiece over the fire, and above a picture of an old fawn with a gray beard." In one corner there was a door which Lucy thought must lead to Mr. Tumnus's bedroom, and on one wall was a shelf full of books. Lucy looked at these while he was setting the tea things out. They had titles like "The Life and Letters of Silenus," or "Nymphs and Their Ways," or "Men, Monks, and Gamekeepers, a Study in Popular Legend," or "Is Man a Myth?" "Now, Daughter of Eve," said the fawn. And really it was a wonderful tea. There was a nice brown egg lightly boiled for each of them, and then sardines on toast, and then buttered toast, and then toast with honey, and then a sugar-topped cake. And when Lucy was tired of eating, the fawn began to talk, and he had wonderful tales to tell of life in the forest. He told about the midnight dances, and how the nymphs who lived in the wells and the dryads who lived in the trees came out to dance with the fawns, about long hunting parties after the milky white stag who could give you wishes if you caught him, about feasting and treasure seeking with the wild red dwarfs in deep mines and caverns far beneath the forest floor, and then about summer when the woods were green and old Silenus on his fat donkey would come to visit them, and sometimes Bacchus himself. And then the streams would run with wine instead of water, and the whole forest would give itself up to jollification for weeks on end. Not that it isn't always winter now, he added gloomily. Then, to cheer himself up, he took out from its case on the dresser a strange little flute that looked as if it were made of straw, and he began to play. And the tune he played made Lucy want to cry and laugh and dance and go to sleep all at the same time. It must have been hours later when she shook herself and said, "Oh, Mr. Tumnus, I'm so sorry to stop you, and I do love that tune, but really, I must go home. I only meant to stay for a few minutes." "It's no good now, you know," said the faun, laying down his flute and shaking his head at her very sorrowfully. "No good?" said Lucy, jumping up and feeling rather frightened. "What do you mean? I've got to go home at once. The others will be wondering what has happened to me." But a moment later she asked, "Mr. Tumnus, whatever is the matter?" For the fawn's brown eyes had filled with tears, and then the tears began trickling down its cheeks, and soon they were running off to the end of its nose, and at last it covered his face. He covered its face with his hands, and he began to howl. "Mr. Tumnus! Mr. Tumnus!" said Lucy in great distress. Don't! What's the matter? Aren't you well? Dear Mr. Tumnus, do tell me what's wrong." But the fawn continued sobbing as if its heart would break. And even when Lucy went over and put her arms around him and lent him her handkerchief, he did not stop. He merely took the handkerchief and kept using it, wringing it out with both hands whenever it got too wet to be any more use, so that presently Lucy was standing in a damp patch. "Mr. Tumnus," bawled Lucy in his ear, shaking him, "do stop! Stop it at once! You ought to be ashamed of yourself, a great big fawn like you. What on earth are you crying about?" Oh, sobbed Mr. Tumnus. "I'm crying because I'm such a bad fawn." "I don't think you're a bad fawn at all," said Lucy. "I think you're a very good fawn. You're the nicest fawn I've ever met." Oh, you wouldn't say that if you knew," replied Mr. Tumnus between sobs. "No, I am a bad fawn. I don't suppose there ever was a worse fawn since the beginning of the world." "But what have you done?" asked Lucy. "My old father now," said Mr. Tumnus. "That's his picture over the mantel. He would never have done anything like this." "Anything like what?" said Lucy. "Like what I've done," said the fawn. "Taken service under the White Witch. That's what I am. I'm in the pay of the White Witch." "The White Witch? Who is she?" "Why, it is she that has got all Narnia under her thumb. It's she that makes its winter. Always winter and never Christmas. Think of that." "How awful," said Lucy. "But what does she pay you for?" That's the worst part of it, said Mr. Tumnus with deep groans. I am a kidnapper for her. That's what I am. Look at me, daughter of Eve. Would you believe that I am the sort of fawn to meet a poor innocent child in the wood, one that had never done me any harm, and pretend to be friendly with it, and invite it home to my cave, all for the sake of lulling it to sleep and then handing it over to the White Witch? No, said Lucy. I'm sure you wouldn't do anything of the sort. But I have, said the fawn. Well, said Lucy rather slowly, for she wanted to be truthful and yet not be too hard on him. Well, that was pretty bad. But you're so sorry for it that I'm sure you will never do it again. Daughter of Eve, don't you understand? Said the fawn. It isn't something that I have done. I'm doing it now, this very moment. What do you mean? Cried Lucy, turning very white. You are the child, said Tumnus. I had orders from the White Witch that if I ever saw a son of Adam or a daughter of Eve in the wood, I was to catch them and hand them over to her. And you are the first I have ever met. And I have pretended to be your friend and asked you to tea. And all the time I've been meaning to wait till you were asleep and then go and tell her. Oh, but you won't, Mr. Tumnus, said Lucy. You won't, will you? Indeed, you really mustn't. And if I don't, he said, beginning to cry again, she is sure to find out. And she'll have my tail cut off, and my horns sawn off, and my beard plucked out, and she'll wave her wand over my beautiful cloven hooves, and turn them into horrid solid hooves, like that of a wretched horse. And if she's extra and specially angry, she'll turn me into stone, and I shall only be a statue of a fawn in her horrible house until the 4 thrones of Cair Paravel are filled, and goodness know when that will happen, or when it will ever happen at all. I'm sorry, Mr. Tumnus, said Lucy, but please, let me go home. Of course I will, said the fawn. Of course, I've got to. I see that now. I hadn't known what humans were like before I met you. Of course, I can't give you up to the witch, not now that I know you. But we must be off at once. I'll see you back to the lamppost. I suppose you can find your own way back from there to Spare and Wardrobe. I'm sure I can, said Lucy. We must go as quietly as we can, said Mr. Tumnus. The whole wood is filled with her spies. Even some of the trees are on her side. They both got up and left the tea things on the table, and Mr. Tumnus once more put up his umbrella and gave Lucy his arm. And when they were out into the snow, the journey back was not at all like the journey to the fawn's cave. They stole along as quickly as they could without speaking a word, and Mr. Tumnus kept to the darkest places. Lucy was relieved when they reached the lamppost again. Do you know your way from here, daughter of Eve? Said Tumnus. Lucy looked very hard between the trees and could just see in the distance a patch of light that looked like daylight. Yes, she said, I can see the wardrobe door. Then be off home as quick as you can, said the fawn, and can you ever Forgive me for what I meant to do." "Why, of course I can," said Lucy, shaking him heartily by the hand. "And I do hope that you won't get into dreadful trouble on my account." "Farewell, daughter of Eve," said he. "Perhaps I may keep the handkerchief?" "Rather," said Lucy, and then ran towards the far-off patch of daylight as quickly as her legs would carry her. And presently, instead of rough branches past her, she felt coats, and instead of crunching snow on her feet, she felt wooden boards. And at once she found herself jumping out of the wardrobe into the same empty room from which the whole adventure had started. She shut the wardrobe door tightly behind her and looked around, panting for breath. It was still raining, and she could hear voices of the others in the passage. "I'm right here," she shouted. "I'm here. I've come back. I'm all right." Well, that ends our story for today. But next time, what are Lucy's brothers and sister going to say? Is she going to be able to get back to Narnia? Are they going to believe that she was ever in Narnia to begin with? We'll have to see. I hope you join us next Tuesday as we continue The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe by C.S. Lewis. I hope you've enjoyed this time together. I hope this has given you a break. Parents, children, I hope you've enjoyed the story. Let me tell you a little secret. It gets better and better. It's a wonderful book. I'll see you next time. Until then.